Mr. Maxwell's Observatory is the sequel to my short story, A Christmas Offertory, which introduced and developed the character of Christopher, who appears central in this tale. This story takes place within a 10-mile radius of Lindbergh Lake, which is nestled up against the Mission Mountains, the range that forms the western border of the Swan Valley in northwest Montana. It is a real place that has permeated my entire being for nearly my whole life. My family began to visit it probably when I was 3 or 4 years old. Today, we have a cabin on the lake that is in its 6th decade of delighting now its 4th generation of the extended Wirth family. The lodge in this story looks exactly like my memory's picture of the same at the Dimedale Bar Ranch, which served as a gathering place for those willing to pay around $4 a night back in the 1950s and 60s to rent a cabin in its proximity. The whole complex of this place, which included not only the lodge and cabins, but a barn, a corral of horses, a boat dock, and beaches, sat on the north shore of Lindbergh Lake. Our family would spend many evenings in the lodge's great room listening to stories told by those who worked there, some of whom would take us on horseback rides. In my looking at the history of the lodge at the Dimedale Bar Ranch, it would have been built around the same time as the lodge in this short story. Today, the cabins in which we stayed and the main lodge are still standing, but now they are privately owned homes. The place where the lodge stands in the short story is somewhere on the mountainside upon which my brothers and I would pick huckleberries with our parents. Finally, there are all sorts of characters in this story. While who they are purported to be is fictionalized, the names are real and they represent people who, over the last 40 years of my being an Episcopal priest, have marched directly into my heart and have taken up permanent residency. For the next hour, I hope you will enjoy Mr. Maxwell's Observatory. In 1918, Mr. Ferguson Maxwell decided to go to college. He was a very bright guy who wanted to study astronomy, and so that was the major that he would declare. And at the same time, because there were not a lot of jobs in that field, he would also take classes in surveying. It had only been a little less than 170 years since the father of our country, George Washington, had immersed himself in the same, and he did all right. So Mr. Maxwell graduated from the University of Montana in Missoula with stellar grades and expertise in both his avocation and vocation. Shortly after, a wonderful opportunity came his way. Because of the land grants given the railroads that built their routes through northern Montana, there was lots of activity with sales of massive amounts of property. Timber and mining companies, along with a few private parties, struck deals with the railroads, and bit by bit, much of this land changed hands. As a result, there was the need for surveying, and Mr. Maxwell fit the bill. It just so happened that he wound up working on a multi-section piece of property in the Mission Mountains, the range which serves as the western border of the nearly 100-mile-long Swan Valley. And thanks to conflicting claims as to the real boundaries delineating who owned what, he had lots of work to do. As soon as the snow melted, Mr. Maxwell, who sadly was a widower, headed to the hills along with his young son, Ferguson Jr., and stayed there until fall arrived. And because the job was so immense, the two returned the next year and did the same again, and the third year. Finally, the project was finished, and the party which hired him was so grateful that they offered him a boatload of money. Mr. Maxwell had also taken economics in college and understood speculation. Instead of just taking the money, he asked for and received a portion of his payment in land, a quarter of a section, or 160 acres. And from the remainder of his pay, he put some in the bank, tucked some between the pages of Sears' Book of Bargains, and he invested a fair amount in Consolidated Edison of New York. With some of the money, the return on his investment, and this property in the Mission Mountains, Mr. Maxwell built a lodge which had a great room, 8 bedrooms off the surrounding balcony on the second floor, a dining hall, a pool parlor with card tables, and thanks to a nearby stream and collecting pond, bathrooms, and a kitchen with gravity-fed running water. And with that, along with his son, he was in the business, principally providing a destination for scientists and students studying at the nearby University of Montana. By now, a decent road went up the Swan, and 2.5 decades later, as the result of the Rural Electrification Administration, electricity went up as well, providing all the modern comforts and conveniences of home. From late spring to early fall, and sometimes even into the winter, students and teachers would come to study dendrology, geology, hydrology, atmospheric science, and Mr. Maxwell's favorite discipline, astronomy. Catering to that in particular, he had cleared the top of an outcrop of rock on the mountainside 200 feet from his lodge and brought in a 20-inch reflecting telescope, stationing it beneath his own design of a retracting roof. Over the years, his love of science was infectious, and his son caught it. Mr. Maxwell, also teaching high school in Missoula, having obtained a teaching certificate a few years earlier, inspired Ferguson Jr. to follow in his father's footsteps. And so, at the age of 18, he also went to college at his dad's alma mater, similarly majoring in astronomy. Ultimately, the once young boy, now mature adult, received his PhD and took a teaching position at the University of Montana, which allowed him in the summer to continue to work at the lodge, which was now known primarily as Mr. Maxwell's Observatory. Years passed, as did Mr. Maxwell. As well, so did his son's ability to be a full professor at the university and run the lodge. And over time, the need to go out into the woods and look at the stars in the sky far from the lights of a city was replaced with brand new ways of teaching, involving slideshows and educational movies shown in the classroom. While Professor Maxwell wanted to keep his dad's realized dream going, common sense told him to mothball it, entrusting it to a service to watch over, and then wait for an opportunity for selling it to strike. Of course, that didn't happen immediately, and since it really wasn't costing much to hang on to, and there wasn't a front burner kind of issue of needing the money, it turned out that the prospect of selling the property ultimately outlived the son. And that explains why one of Professor Maxwell's favorite students, a nice fellow named Frank Hakim, was driving up Highway 83 towards Kalispell on the snowy afternoon of the 12th day of Christmas, January 5th, 2010. Many years before, Frank happened to be a student at the University of Montana Law School when, as a diversion from torts, contracts, and procedure, he took Professor Maxwell's class, Astronomy for Non-Scientists. They studied Aristotle, Galileo, Copernicus, Ptolemy, and other giants in early thought, as well as enough physics to understand in a general way how the heavens worked. As a result of that, Frank found the departure from the study of law that he needed, and Ferguson developed a lifelong friendship with this student who would soon become his lawyer. Having remained a bachelor, Ferguson had no heirs, And so when the end of his life was near, he called Frank and asked him to take the property and do something with it that would benefit people in the best possible way. There was nothing more specific than that in his wishes, and so Frank's law firm, Kakim, and Kakim, a partnership with his two brothers located in St. Paul, Minnesota, took custody of the property with the intent of selling it, establishing a charitable trust, and then, along with managing the corpus, be benevolent with grants from the interest and investment growth gained from the sale, combined with the rest of Professor Maxwell's sizable estate. When land was divided up among the railroads in the very beginning of their expansion across the West, it was called checkerboarding, because in both directions from the track, every other section of land bordering the tracks was given to the railroad, with the remaining sections being retained by the government. That was the incentive the railroad had to build across the West. Over the years, much of the railroads and government land had been sold or traded, and Mr. Maxwell's observatory, with its 160 acres, was now eyed by a developer who was planning quite the project on a section of land right next door to that, which had been given over to the stewardship of the law firm. And as could be expected, long and tedious negotiations had finally nearly led to a sale for top dollar. It seemed exactly what the firm desired, and the developer was ecstatic at the prospect that he would now have the acreage for the approach to his own version of a lodge, that being a very luxurious resort and spa. The added property he would gain from this purchase would provide plenty of room for staff, as well as for all the other outbuildings needed for such a grand complex. As well, the location of the observatory's telescope, long since gone, would turn into the most remarkable spot for afternoon and evening cocktails for the guest. He would even retain the name of Mr. Maxwell's Observatory for the space, replacing the rusty base of the telescope with a full bar, a gas fireplace, and wonderful outdoor furniture under a gazebo. The developer, sharing that aside with Frank, bothered the lawyer tremendously. He had remembered being at that clearing in the middle of the night, looking into the dark sky, with Professor Maxwell pointing out the constellations of Lacerta, Pegasus, and Triangulum. Converting that nearly sacred spot to anything but what it had been for almost a century remained the only hiccup preventing Frank's already having signed the buy-sell agreement to transfer ownership. He wanted the terms of the sale to include preserving the spot of the telescope as an underdeveloped, historically significant area. Undoubtedly, however, in the final moment, with pen in hand, Frank would cave on his request. As Voltaire said in so many words, "Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good." Frank remembered from years past that driving up the Swan at night can be fairly lonely. As he headed toward his meeting to be held early the next day with the developer in Kalispell, he was delighted that his rental sport utility vehicle, or SUV, had all the newest bells and whistles that any vehicle could possibly have. And that included satellite radio, which thankfully would be broadcasting the Orange Bowl football game between Iowa and Georgia Tech from Dolphin Stadium in Miami Gardens, Florida. At the very least, that would keep him awake. The flight in the corporate jet from Minneapolis-St. Paul to Missoula's Johnson Bell Field was long, and he was tired. However, with only an hour and a half to go, and the thought that tomorrow the sale of the property would be finalized, the extra effort of making it to Kalispell tonight via the highway was well worth it. And still, there was that playing of the game that would entertain him. Now, he could have flown directly to Kalispell, but he wanted to see Missoula again and drive by Mr. Maxwell's observatory, especially as darkness fell. As luck would have it, it turned out there was a break in the clouds, and soon he would be able to see again those constellations Professor Maxwell had brought to life decades before. He felt drawn to do this one last time before unloading the property for an amazing amount of money. In his briefcase, next to his suitcase, in the back seat, was the sales agreement, which had been worked on by his brother, the partner who was more expert in real estate law, and all the contingencies that could arise. Frank knew everything there was to know about patents, and the third brother was the managing partner who kept all the junior attorneys busy. And even though Frank was not the most experienced in this kind of law, he had known Professor Maxwell, stayed at the observatory several times, and felt personally duty-bound to carry out the task. Frank took pride in the fact that he was a partner in a good firm that cared about people, and even though it was big enough to have a private plane, it was still small enough to where the three senior partners knew all the subordinate lawyers by name, were aware of their families, and honored the need for all the employees to have predictable days off, especially during the holidays. So, all was well in the world, and God was in God's heaven, and Frank thought of how 24 hours from now he would be heading back home with the promise of a very large check in his pocket, ready to do good for the world per Professor Ferguson Maxwell's implied wishes. And that was when, as he was rounding a tight corner, just 400 feet past mile marker 31, that the headlights of Frank's rental SUV came eye to eye with a rare gray wolf sitting in the middle of the northbound lane of the Swan Valley Highway. Besides being a good lawyer, Frank was also the convener of the Greater Minneapolis-St. Paul Consortium of Animal Welfare Agencies. Their whole purpose was to host an annual dinner and auction at the grandest of hotels in the city, which raised a mind-boggling amount of money for the various shelters, spay and neuter clinics, and advocacy groups whose concern was endangered or threatened species. And so, probably between Frank's DNA and spinal column was a pre-programmed response to turn as sharply as was possible, forget the consequences, and spare the wolf, which is exactly what he did. It was kind of a slow motion thing. The vehicle crossed the center line, tipped on its right wheels, went crashing through the orange cones that warned of the absence of a guardrail, which was scheduled to be replaced shortly, and off into the ravine Frank flew on his second flight of the day, but this one unscheduled. He was aware that for a few seconds the SUV was now sliding on the passenger side door, but then it flipped onto the vehicle's top and sledded downhill the rest of the way on the deep bed of snow, what the Highway Patrol report would later measure as 87 feet. Oddly, it was a quiet ride, and amazingly, he heard nothing break or crash. When the sliding was done, Frank was upside down inside the SUV with the headlights pointing slightly up and snow encrusting the windshield. As he regained his composure, the first thing he thought of was that he didn't hear the cry of the wolf. Score one victory. Second, he was alive and really not injured at all, save being uncomfortably suspended in the air by the seatbelt. Third, what a great thing it was that he always packed an emergency kit containing a candle, matches, a space blanket, and lots of Hershey chocolate bars. Living in Minnesota, he religiously traveled with such a kit, and for this drive, he had packed the very same items in his suitcase, wherever his suitcase was. And he had his cell phone, and the SUV had an emergency satellite button on the rear view mirror. He pushed the button, which would have activated the signal, sending it out to the antenna, and the antenna signal to a satellite, which would bring immediate help. And that would have worked if the antenna was not some 60 feet up the hill in the snow, having snagged a fallen limb of a tree in just the right way, tearing it off the roof. After the task of freeing himself from the seatbelt, with the ambient light from the headlights reflecting off the snow and filtering in through the side windows, Frank found his phone and noticed that it had absolutely no bars indicating reception. Far from panicking, he found a suitcase, got out his candy bars, wrapped himself in the foil blanket, and sat inside of the upside-down SUV on the ceiling of his car and began eating chocolate, as much for comfort as for calories and energy, waiting for someone to find him. Because the vehicle was turned onto its top, and thus the gas tank could be leaking, he thought the candles and matches were probably not a good idea. It was not horribly cold anyway, and soon someone would see the light shining in the trees, put two and two together, and rescue him. About the time Frank was unwrapping the second candy bar, he heard a rustling against the car. And turning to look out the driver's side window, he expected to see someone who would help him back up to the highway. Instead, he saw the wolf, the perpetrator of this mess. And he swore that Canis Lupus was grinning at him just prior to walking away into the bushes. It was kind of like wolf wins, human loses. And for the first time, Frank was none too happy for sending $5,000 about a month earlier to the Wolf Recovery and Reentry Association of Wyoming and Montana. Christopher was a medically retired Episcopal priest in his 37th year. Shortly after he was ordained, a panic disorder, a form of depression, was simply derailing him from his vocation, despite the fact that he had lived with it for 23 years prior. In way too short of time, as happened to so many people with depression, Christopher, in his case, went from being featured on the religion page of the daily newspaper when he arrived from seminary in Cambridge, Mass., to being homeless and living in the foothills of Salt Lake City in a makeshift hovel. However, thanks to the ministry of a dog and a cat, not to mention a bird and mouse befriending him when he was at his lowest and determined to simply die one Christmas Eve, Christopher bounced back to life when, in a most amazing way, he became the patient of a very competent doctor, and a prescription of antidepressants sent the panic disorder packing. And once again, life was good. Leaving the streets after so many years of living on them was more of an adjustment than he was capable of accomplishing. So a friend of his who knew this guy, whose second cousin was a clerk at the hardware store in the small western town of Seeley Lake in northwest Montana, put Christopher in touch with the property management company of an old lodge that needed a caretaker. Not much had to be done to keep the place in shape, but it did need someone looking out for its well-being. Also, since vandalism could strike a vacant property, just having a light on in the place and a truck in the driveway would go a long way to guarding against kids just being kids, playing with matches, or for that matter, others thinking this would be a great place to throw the party to end all parties. So, having first chatted with the property managers in Seeley Lake to see if it was okay to bring Otis the cat and Bill the dog, Christopher and his four-legged companions headed north to set up shop in the old lodge. He found it a wonderful alternative to the streets and exactly what the doctor ordered for his recuperation. For the first time in his life, he had evenings of leisure, and that was a feast he never thought he would taste. And thanks to satellite television, he had all the comforts of a very large and grand home. By the world's standards, in his past life, he had been a loser, giving his living on the streets and up in the hills. But then, as gourmet chef and New Testament scholar, the Reverend Robert Farrar Capon had written, God really only cared for the last, the lost, the least, the little, and the dead. Christopher had already been 4 of those 5, and so he felt blessed. He also developed this thing for finding others, some who had found themselves member of those ranks, and in time, 6 other pilgrims joined him at Mr. Maxwell's Observatory. They all contributed to the effort of living exuberantly, drenched in the blessings of God, each in their own way. They were a community that cherished the company of each other. And every evening at cocktail hour, which consisted primarily of Mountain Dew, orange juice, and for Christopher and another who imbibed, a low-budget blended scotch, they recounted just how wonderful that day had been for all of them, including Otis the cat and Bill the dog. They simply lived in an intentional state of thanksgiving. It just so happened that Christopher decided in the late afternoon of this 12th night of Christmas to go to Seeley Lake, 17 miles south on the highway that intersected the county road which fed to the private lane serving Mr. Maxwell's observatory, to get a few provisions and check the mail. He was 3 miles into his drive on the highway when he saw the soft illumination of the trees on the right side of the road. Knowing that there was nothing down in the ravine that had lights of its own, Christopher pulled off to the shoulder of the highway just south of the Beaver Creek turnoff and put on his emergency flashers. He then descended to the upside-down SUV, which contained a fairly chilled lawyer. Reaching the vehicle, he shined in a flashlight, which he had carried with him, and behold, Mr. Frank Hakim smiled back at him. Opening the door against the snow was problematic. Thankfully, with Frank turning the ignition key to accessory, he could lower the window. And one thing led to another. And not only was Frank freed, so were his briefcase and his suitcase as well. Hi, I'm Christopher. Frank, thanks for saving me. And together, they shuffled up the incline and both got into the truck to go at least somewhere to try and salvage the rest of the evening. Continuing on Highway 83 towards Seeley Lake, they saw in the distance emergency flashing lights, and upon reaching them, they stopped for the Missoula County Deputy Sheriff, who Christopher just happened to know because he lived but a couple of miles north of the lodge as the crow flies up the Swan on Cold Creek Road. The officer explained that there had been a huge avalanche 500 feet ahead, and as a result, there was no way anyone was heading farther south that night. Amazingly, the slide took place at a spot Frank had just passed minutes before it happened. Thankfully, no one was trapped in it, but it was large, and therefore there'd be no clearing of the snow until tomorrow morning. Seeing the deputy was fortuitous, however, because it allowed Frank to report his skidding off the road. After some exchange of papers regarding his rental car upside down in the ravine, Christopher and his passenger turned around. Frank mentioned to Christopher that he was a lawyer, needing to get to a meeting, so going 70 miles north to Kalispell was an option, right? He'd certainly pay Christopher well for his trouble. Now, normally that would not have been a problem, but as Christopher explained, having heard a report earlier on the day on the radio, another slide, this one with large rocks, blocked the route to the Kalispell area, the flatland above the lake, as the Salish Indians called it. "But not to worry," said Christopher. "We've a lodge with an extra bedroom." And that is how Frank, much to what would become his surprise, began the return trip to Mr. Maxwell's observatory that evening, so many years after he took that class in astronomy, when he needed an intellectual break from law school. It took a while to get there. To begin, you had to turn onto the Lindbergh Lake Road at mile marker 34 and head to the Forest Service cutoff that climbed the hills around the lake. And then you took another right and ascended even higher on a private lane, and finally you were there. Frank grabbed his stuff from Christopher's truck, and as he made his way into the lodge, a wave of nostalgic wonder simply overwhelmed him. Since he had not yet disclosed his full identity as the lawyer greasing the skids to sell the place, as he was sure that was a sore topic for Christopher, he still felt morally obligated to do so once he was settled. And looking around at the familiar settings from so many decades ago, when he had last visited the place during law school, it was simply spellbound. Thankfully, Bill the dog rushed in, and displaying the same unqualified and unlimited love that God has for all, put an end to the silence. In fact, soon out of every corner of the place came people welcoming their guest with open arms. Cocktail hour had concluded an hour earlier, but Christopher still offered Mountain Dew, orange juice, scotch. Frank went for the scotch. And despite the fact that a large bottle of the stuff he was served cost far less than but a shot of that which he had in his liquor cabinet at home, as well as on the corporate jet, what he was given was nothing short of an elixir of the gods. Exhausted, he fell into an overstuffed chair in front of the roaring fireplace and was overpowered by his good fortune to have been rescued. Christopher also joined him in a libation, his not having had one earlier. During their time of relaxing before the fire, it was very briefly mentioned by Christopher that the place was up for sale, and that at some point they all would probably have to move away from the lodge, and, most tragically, one another. But that rough news was only a short interlude on their recounting the good news that Frank had escaped any injury in the accident. After his drink and the second he was given, Frank was escorted to the table, where tonight's meal had been delayed a little bit because of the unusual events of the day. Dinner was a very hearty lentil soup with garlic bread and some broccoli on the side, a vegetable made unusually fabulous because it was smothered with a buttery breadcrumb and lemon juice topping, just like the cook's mom used to make when he was a kid. Now, Frank had eaten in a gazillion five-star restaurants around the world, but this night's dinner was simply beyond description. And besides the savory soup, what filled him the most was the obvious love all in the household had for one another, even extending the same to him, the lawyer, who, unbeknownst to them, was about to pull the rug out from under their cheerful existence. Dessert was huckleberry cobbler made with berries they had picked themselves and then froze 5 months ago. Refusing to let their guest help with the dishes, the residents of Mr. Maxwell's Observatory ushered Frank up to his room, the one in the corner with 2 windows pointing west and north. He had slept in this very room years before when he first relished the wisdom of Professor Maxwell, and he got ready to call it quits on what had been quite a day's adventure. As he looked out his west window, he saw Christopher taking a fairly generous helping of the lentil soup along with some kibble to the barn. And there waiting for him was a fellow who was wagging his tail. Obviously, it was an outdoor dog. The pooch welcomed the warm supper, allowed for a pat on the head, and then as Christopher retired back to the lodge, the dog, a large kind of German shepherd kind of guy, but that wasn't quite it, took to his meal, and having finished it, licked his chops and went on his evening constitutional, and then came back to the barn. He circled his fluffed up straw 3 times, as he always did, and then settled into sleep for the long, dark night. And Frank did the same, again after all these years, smelling the scent of the Pendleton wool blankets under his chin, and hearing in his mind's eye the lectures from college that charmed him about the stars above. He smiled, believing that with the angels and archangels and all the company of heaven, there was Mr. Maxwell, who he had never met, sitting beside his son, the professor, who, not unlike in class so long ago, was still teaching, using the opening line for every initial gathering of students he instructed. So, 13.8 billion years ago, there was this Big Bang. And shortly after that, in astronomical time, at the first brawl of the wild football game, which just so happened to take place the year my dad was born, Montana beat Montana State 18-6. But I get ahead of myself. And Frank fell asleep, awash in the comfort of a very special lodge, a home, a place that years ago had wonderfully nourished his soul. The morning was filled with activity. It was Epiphany, after all, steeped in the story of the wise men coming to the manger and visiting Jesus, the newborn Son of God. As such, January 6th was a big-time day in the life of the residents of Mr. Maxwell's Observatory. Hearing on the radio station from Kalispell that the entire Swan Highway was now cleared of rocks and avalanches, Frank thought that after breakfast, he would corner Christopher and tell him prior to leaving what was what, disclosing that he was the skunk invading the picnic. Breakfast was remarkably festive and included galette de veau, a puff pastry with almond paste that had, as the Epiphany tradition prescribes, a single hidden dried bean within it. Raymond, one of the residents, discovered it in his portion, and as a result was proclaimed king for a day, reminiscent of the 3 kings who visited Jesus in the popular carol. With the overflowing joy abounding, Frank lost his courage to share the grim news that their home was being sold to another who in but a few weeks and after closing would enfold it into his resort's plan. After Greek omelets and lots of strong coffee, Christopher announced that he would be celebrating the Holy Eucharist, or Holy Communion, at noon in the great room of the lodge. To that end, they needed the cook to make some unleavened bread. As well, while the lodge didn't have a large selection of wine, there was sherry in the cabinet, and that would do wonderfully. And so, for one of the 7 great feast days of the Christian year, Christmas, Ascension Day, the day of Pentecost, Trinity Sunday, All Saints' Day, and Easter being the others, they prepared for a very festive service. Earlier, thanks to the good people of the Blackfoot Telephone Cooperative, Frank was able to call his 2 brothers to tell them what was going on and that it would be nice if a driver could come and pick him up and return him to Missoula so he could get the plane and take it to Kalispell and bring the deal to fruition. He left the kitchen where the wall phone was and ventured into the great room and noticed part of the community's routine that led them through the daily care of Mr. Maxwell's observatory. Sue, A woman he had met last night at dinner was polishing the spindles of the railing coming down from the second floor to the first. Those spindles and nearly all the furniture, not unlike the lodge itself, had been made out of the trees cut on the property so many, many years before. Every morning, she took care to wipe them down, sometimes polishing them with lemon oil. No wonder it looked and smelled extraordinary. Sue had initially found her way to Mr. Maxwell's observatory because, as a grad student, she had edited a book of tributes to Professor Maxwell when he retired. Of course, the celebration marking the end of his career was at the lodge. She returned years later, now considerably sight-impaired, when she heard from friends of the gathering of those living there who were committed to community life. So, while Frank thought it sad she could not see the fruit of her labor, as did the rest, in reality, she actually saw it in its full glory in her mind, as vividly as she did long ago. Still, in one of the rooms upstairs, at a desk, sat a woman named Krista. She was incredibly brilliant and had this passion for websites. She could design one that was fabulous. And so, from the lodge, she worked worldwide, not only satisfying customers with her unique sense of creativity, but also brought in sufficient income to keep their home humming along. As someone who just did not like the city and yearned for genuine community, she found out that this place existed when a plumbing contractor who had done some work at the lodge asked her to build his website. And since Christopher had given the plumbing 4 stars and in the process described the place so poetically, she couldn't help but wonder what it was all about. And one thing led to another, and now here she was. Her room abutted that of Stuart's. His gift was being skilled in the art of carpentry. Not only could he fix anything within the lodge, he had a lovely sense of creativity. Out of the shavings from his plane, for example, he could create ornaments that would sell in the shops of Seeley Lake prior to Christmas. Stuart had a past that was a bit checkered, not unlike the early land distribution of the Swan Valley. Lots of clergy and public defenders had been on the receiving end of his, "Hey, I'm in a world of hurt," during his early days. And it was one of those Missoula County public defenders who steered Stuart to Mr. Maxwell's observatory when he heard through the grapevine of law school alums that the place Professor Maxwell so loved had been given over to a classmate, one Frank Hakim, for his conservancy. So Stuart showed up in the car, the Beast, and simply said with hat in hand, "Hey, I'm in a world of hurt." Stuart and the Beast never left. Raymond lived next to Stuart. He was certainly the most colorful of them all, with an invention of history that made it even more remarkable than it ever could be. He promised one day that a Western Airlines Boeing 737 with his Cadillac convertible on board, containing $500 in the glove box, would arrive from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, and all would be well. Raymond also proclaimed himself the sexton of the place. No one quite remembers how he found the lodge. One day, Christopher arrived back from his drive to Missoula, and there was Raymond outside, sweeping the walkway to the front entrance to the wraparound porch. When Jesus said that we don't know where the wind comes from or where it's going, Christopher basically thought of Raymond. He was an interesting fellow, simply born of the Spirit. Gary, the 6th of the 7 occupants of the second floor, was a gentle bear of a guy who would enter each day with the express purpose of doing something nice for everyone. He wore a blue jumpsuit, having a closet full of them, and because he had worked in a French restaurant owned by his parents in Mexico City, where he grew up, he was the resident chef at Mr. Maxwell's Observatory, although in one way or another, the rest of the extended family always would pitch in to help. His claim to fame was serving a veggie taco smothered in, of all things, a creamy hollandaise sauce. Some thought the taco was surpassed by his Mexican grilled street corn drizzled with sous vide. It was a tough choice to decide which of the many dishes he crafted was the best. He'd been the sous chef at the golf course restaurant in Seeley Lake when he found out about Mr. Maxwell's Observatory, and the move for him was goodbye stress, hello tranquility. And then there was Ben, whom they called Doc. They did that because he had, believe it or not, graduated from Harvard Medical, the whole 9 yards. One day, he just got tired of the traffic in Chicago, where his clinic was located downtown, and figured that Social Security and Medicare were now his cup of tea. While gassing up in Seeley Lake on his first road trip west, he met Christopher on the other side of the fuel pump, and after some small talk about the weather and who was going where, they found themselves sharing a couple of cups of coffee and some donuts in the gas station's dining area. Ben became immediately sold on the place, and as a result, Doc now offered Bill the dog, Otis the cat, and for that matter, any of the others, informal advice he had let his license lapse on dealing with poison ivy, a wasp sting, how to cool a sore throat, or how to comfort those who had overindulged on Christopher's chili, the recipe of which had been handed down to him from his father. Having also run a clinic, he understood business, and so he kept the books for Mr. Maxwell's Observatory. As well, Doc was the resident custodian of the woods. If there was a piece of litter on any of the trails within 20 miles of the place, it wasn't there for long. Graffiti on a rock 10 miles up the hill was met with his wire brush. This valley was his adopted home, and he kept it clean. No wonder Frank looked at the assorted residents of the lodge and marveled as to the companionship they shared among themselves. He also was moved deeply by their hospitality extended to him. It was not just a well-oiled machine. It was the grace of God incarnate. All were assembled in the great room. Christopher joined them wearing his alb with a festive stole, ready to celebrate the Eucharist. At noon, the lodge was bathed in light streaming in through the south-facing windows and warmed by the fire and the lingering smell of a good breakfast. It was filled with joy. It was Epiphany, the manifestation of Jesus to the world, and therefore an important day in the liturgical calendar. Frank had told Christopher, his having been invited to the service, that he was going to have to leave fairly soon. Just a few minutes prior, he had placed another phone call to his brothers from the old phone booth in the great room and was assured that, among other things, a car was indeed headed to the observatory to bring him back to Missoula, and that was the reason he might have to depart mid-service. Christopher put Frank at ease by telling him that leaving early was just fine, and added that in his experience as a parish priest, members of the congregation often left prior to the post-communion prayer to get home for the game or for a better seat at the Pancake House restaurant. And with that discussion out of the way, worship began. Central to the Feast of the Epiphany is the story of the wise men who visited Jesus. It's found in Matthew's Gospel, and Christopher read it to them. After that, and a short sermon, came the Nicene Creed, the prayers, and then the offertory. The offertory was one of Christopher's favorite parts of the whole service. Besides bread and wine, or in this case, Christian brother sherry, being brought to the altar, all those living there gave what they did, if not what they had. There was an offering plate near the door which stayed there all the time, collecting things throughout the week, symbolic of what the residents contributed to the life of the place day by day. It wasn't like a regular offering plate that would be brought to the altar just prior to Holy Communion. Its purpose was to remain there in the midst of the usual traffic of the 7 residents, to remind them that this was what they were all about, offering their time, their talent, their energy in ministry in the name of Christ. So it was not out of the ordinary that on her way to the service this particular noon, Sue dropped her dust rag into the plate. Ben placed in it a reminder to all to take their vitamins. Stuart normally tossed in some nails and screws, but this time he offered some shavings of wood. Frank tossed in a $50 bill. And then came communion, and Frank exited early, just as he thought he would have to do, following his receiving the bread of heaven and the cup of salvation. The others waved him goodbye, but stayed where they were for the rest of the service, savoring the love they shared for one another. As Frank was walking out, he stopped by the offering plate, an old Marie Callender's pie pan, and dropped in something else. Frank's trip back to Missoula was totally uneventful. The orange cones had been replaced at the scene of the abrupt departure from the highway 21 hours ago. And given all the tire marks in the snow, it was obvious the SUV had been hauled the 87 feet back up the hill and carted away. For once, Frank was grateful he had checked the box for unlimited insurance on the rental agreement. As they headed toward and then through Seeley Lake, there was evidence of the avalanche from the night before, but it had been cleared from the road. Arriving at the private aviation section of the airport, Frank saw that the firm's plane was ready to go. And so he boarded, handing the pilot a special request concerning the route to Kalispell and his meeting with the buyer of Mr. Maxwell's Observatory. Normally, a plane would fly nearly due north, 23 miles, with just a tip of the hat to the west, to land at Glacier International Airport. But this afternoon, he wanted to fly over the place that was to be sold to the developer and see it setting from above on this clear but cold January day. And so off they went into takeoff, and at the proper altitude, they veered 80 degrees or so northeast, and then after a minute, turned left and proceeded up the Swan Valley. Looking out his window on the port side of the plane and relaxing with a glass of his premier barrel 28-year-old single malt scotch, Frank began to smile. He did so because he thought that right around that very moment in time, following lunch and a few chores Christopher had mentioned that he needed to do, he'd return to the setting for that noon's Holy Eucharist. Christopher might even wonder aloud to Bill the dog and Otis the cat what it must have been like for Mary and Joseph to have had these astrologers from the East show up with such extraordinary gifts. This, of course, is also one of the themes in Matthew's account of this marvelous visitation of these fellows to the Holy Family. Putting away everything that was to be used again on the following Sunday, Christopher noticed the offering pie plate at the inside of the great room's French doors. And beside the usual gifts the folks of the household presented to their Lord was an envelope and its enclosed contents ripped in half. Since that was quite unusual, he took out the papers and placed the halves next to one another on the makeshift altar. It was, of course, to the saints and angels who obviously could see something churning in the works of decency and goodness, a holy moment to behold. The unsigned buy-sell agreement, which would have begun the process to transfer the property to the developer in Kalispell, was no longer in the cards. Stunned and trembling, now having seen that the seller had been listed in the second line of this official agreement to purchase real estate as the trustees of Mr. Maxwell's observatory, he called the entire household together and shared with them the unfathomable news as to who the stranger in their midst had been. He also remembered and mentioned something fairly theological. Not unlike the event of 2,000 years ago in Bethlehem, here in the Mission Mountains of Montana, a lavish gift similarly had been given them. These 7 residents of Mr. Maxwell's observatory were the very same kind of folks that St. Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, identified as the body of Christ. Mark Twain is often believed to have opined, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. An accompanying note, written in longhand and now stained with Christopher's tears, simply said, "Dear champions of the gospel and companions in Christ, stay here and stay together, for you are Jesus to the world. Continue to shine as a manifestation of Christ, the very meaning of the Feast of the Epiphany. And by the way, we will be setting up a trust to keep you comfortably in business, that is to say, in ministry. Thanks for your hospitality. I'll be in touch. Best wishes, Frank Kakim. Kakim, and Kakim, attorneys at law, St. Paul, Minnesota." Now, bursting into shouts of joy with hugs all around the company residing at Mr. Maxwell's observatory, which included some of the least of these in the world's eyes, realized yet again the obvious, that they had always been the beloved of God's. And so by acclamation in response to these exuberant blessings, they elected to move cocktails an hour and 17 minutes earlier to that very moment, Mountain Standard Time. And the Mountain Dew, the orange juice, and cheap scotch, Christopher and Doc's preference, began to flow with an abundance reflective of God's grace. Gary even tossed together tapenade canopies. Up in the air and flying over the wonderful comedy of life taking place 15,000 feet below, Frank thought about 2 things. The first was that there was a developer in Kalispell who would be hot as melted iron mad over this and might even probably try to sue. But not unlike the phrase in criminal law that while you can indict a ham sandwich, that doesn't necessarily mean you get a conviction. Trying to sue didn't necessarily mean winning a judgment. After all, there was a point of strong disagreement in the deliberations over the spot of the ancient telescope becoming a bar. And equally as important, the contract had never been signed by both parties. The second thought was that he had just blown for the firm, with his brother's permission and wholehearted support, an incredible management fee caring for a trust that would have been astronomical in size. But then again, Professor Maxwell's lectures concerning the heavens never said anything about owning them. We were only called to enjoy them. Even so, that thought concerning their fee is what caused him to really think it ironic that in Aramaic, the first language Jesus would come to hear from Mary and Joseph and then speak, Frank's last name, Kakim, is the very same from which we get wise men. Again, in the way that the world works, What a fool he had been. What a fool he had been for Christ. Isn't life wonderful? He cheerfully sipped his drink, contemplating a second round in a short while, probably as they were flying over North Dakota towards St. Paul. And at that exact moment, per Frank's direction handed to the pilot earlier, and undoubtedly pleasing God in a most amazing way, the plane banked 90 degrees right. And he used some words from the second chapter of the Gospel according to Matthew concerning the story of those other wise men who had visited Jesus. Mr. Frank Kakim, Esquire, also went home another way. And Brother Wolf, sitting outside the lodge's barn, having just heard the jubilant cries from the inside, looked up, and he saw the white vapor trail of the corporate jet having changed directions, and thought, well, that worked out exactly as I planned. I think I'll take a nap before dinner. And he circled in his mound of straw, again 3 times in honor of the Blessed Trinity, and fell asleep, confident in the love of the Lord. After all, why wouldn't he be? God was indeed in God's heaven, and all was well at Mr. Maxwell's observatory.